Hey everybody, my name is Nat Rom, and I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Fifth Wheel Press. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to our very first workshop, which is an asynchronous chapbook workshop, in advance of our chapbook submissions opening on September 17th. So today we're going to touch a lot of topics that I think are important, as well as answer some questions that were submitted by folks that follow us on social media. So things that you all want to know and things that we think are important to the process as well. Let's get started. So the first thing that I really want to bring up before I talk about anything else is sequencing, just because it's actually a lot simpler than I think most people realize, at least for me. I find that when I'm sequencing work, I really want to make sure that there's a conversation going on between the pieces. It's kind of like a game of telephone where everything makes sense at the end, as opposed to like when you play telephone and it doesn't make sense at the end, and that's the whole point. So you don't have to end where you started, but the path to how you got there should be clear. So that's basically to say that you don't necessarily need a narrative arc in your sequence, so much as it just needs to make sense, like where you start and where you end and what is in the middle in terms of continuity. So the other thing that comes out in sequencing is the idea of something having a sense of purpose. And that's sort of the so what of the chapbook. Like, what do these poems have to do with each other? What do they have in common? And if it's a thinner thread, if you're finding that you're arranging and you don't really have that like strong connection between the pieces, you ask yourself how you can draw that out. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I guess I just want to stress that with sequencing, it really is, for me, a conversation. It's how a piece speaks to the first piece in the book, the last piece in the book, the piece on either side of it, where it is, if there's a break before or after it. So that's a lot of questions that you can ask yourself. But that's the kind of questions that I ask myself when I'm sequencing something, is like, how does this talk to the pieces around it? Like what role does it play? Like, what does it have to say in that conversation? The next thing that I want to touch is formatting, because we did get a lot of questions about this. And I also think it's important because as much as nobody wants to admit it, if something is formatted just way off, it's a lot less likely that it's going to be considered for the strength of the manuscript, because it's just distracting. Like, that's kind of the long and the short of it. So I'll dive into kind of how I do things, how we prefer things, but do know that everything does vary from press to press, publisher to publisher. So for title page, kind of the first thing you see, I tend to format my title pages with the title and with the author name, if the call is not anonymous. That's important because a lot of places do read chapbooks blind up to a certain stage in their editing process. So be sure to pay attention to that and leave out any mentions of your name or like identifying information, if that's the case. And then the other thing that I do want to note about guidelines varying from press to press is that some presses do prefer for you to use a specific style for the title page. If it's not specified, centered is totally safe, but it's not really something that I feel like has a hard, fast rule. So moving into a table of contents from there, this depends from press to press. I've found two ways of making a table of contents that are both sort of like what I call editor friendly. The first is a 2-column, 2-row table, where the first row is essentially a header and the second row contains all of the titles on the left and the pages on the right. If I do this, I tend to make the table borders a lighter gray so that they're visible, but they're unobtrusive. And then the second is to list all of the titles and use the tab key to push the numbers further out into their own column. And I tend to only use this method if a publisher has specifically said no built-in tables, just because it gets a little messy formatting wise, as anyone who uses the tab key often in their poetry probably knows already. And then finally, the table of contents is also a good place for content warnings if you have them. A lot of places don't necessarily require a content warning, but me personally as a writer, I feel like it's fair to give some level of content warning if I'm submitting something that has really sensitive content. So for me, that generally kind of tends to err on the side of substance use and sexual assault, but other topics could include death, dysphoria, homophobia, transphobia, racism, other forms of discrimination. And then anything else that you feel like if you were to go in reading it, and you'd feel like kind of jarred if you were to just go in without a content warning, it's probably best to err on the side of caution there. And then the other thing I do want to speak to is sort of why we do ask for content warnings with our manuscripts, is that as a survivor myself, someone who does have a lot of traumatic things that do trigger me, I think it's important to at least be able to put yourself in the headspace that the manuscript deserves. So having that heads up really allows you to walk into a manuscript knowing that you're in the right place to be reading it and you are able to give it that attention. And so I know this is something that is somewhat controversial, but I am really pro content warning. So let's talk fonts. Some places care about specific fonts, some do not. We are on the side of caring less. But please, that being said, if somewhere doesn't specify a specific font, do still keep it legible. So here's a non-exhaustive list of fonts that I've seen on submission guidelines: Times New Roman, Garamond, Arial, Helvetica, Verdana. Generally, you want a standard serif or sans serif font unless there's something aesthetically specific that you're doing with the font. And I will also say that just because Word or Google Docs has a certain font doesn't necessarily make it a standard font. Fonts do differ from processor to processor, version to version, and computer to computer. So in terms of page count, our range is 20 to 35. But I will say that this tends to be the thing that varies the most from press to press. So some presses will take a shorter or longer manuscript, so be sure to check their specific page count. And in terms of a versatile length for a chap, in the mid to high 20s or low 30s is kind of a safe page count. This generally doesn't include the end matter, so that's your title page, table of contents, or acknowledgements. So in terms of other things to include or not to include, I generally say don't include your address unless it is specifically asked for. If it is asked for, I think it's also worth an ask why if they don't specify, just because that is sensitive information. I mean, that's your location potentially. So I feel like that's at least worth an ask why, you know? So in terms of including a bio, I do, unless the call is for a fully anonymized manuscript. And I also keep my bio pretty professionally based. So that's previous publications, editorial positions. If there's space, you know, I like to keep my bio pretty short. I'll mention that I'm a student, and some places do prefer shorter bios than others. And in terms of acknowledgements, most places will ask for an acknowledgement of previous publications anywhere in the chapbook manuscript. So that's individual journals, magazines, or other publications. And then the other thing that I do say to include in acknowledgements is any other credit that may be due beyond previous publications. So that's like erasure sources, if poems came from a prompt like Escape Roll or National Poetry Writing Month, things like that. But also do keep the acknowledgements literary at this stage. Like things like thank yous, etc., can come once the manuscript has been accepted. In terms of editing a chapbook when you're getting it ready to submit, there's a couple of things that I tend to do, and all of them really have the name of consistency in mind. And so I like to edit first for formatting consistency, and that's to make sure that there are things like punctuation is consistent at the end of lines, etc. Which that, of course, can kind of vary and differ from form to form, piece to piece to some degree, if it remains clearly stylistic. But the other thing that I think I don't always catch on my first read through is how dialogue is denoted. And that's like, I'll sometimes use quotes, sometimes italics, sometimes something else. That's something to make sure is consistent across the board. And then the other thing that I do for kind of almost formatting consistency's sake is to write new work to fit with the old work. And this is where the idea of the conversation comes into play. Like if you have a thinner thread between the pieces in the book already, something that you can potentially do is write something else to fit the holes that you need to fill. And so the thing that where formatting consistency really comes in here is that I feel like when I'm in doubt in that situation, I tend to borrow forms from other pieces. I did that recently with a chapbook of mine that I've been sending out. And I do find that it helps sort of lend a layer of consistency to the overall book. Like if you feel like you've kind of edited for consistency as much as you can and you're still sort of missing something, that's a way to go. And I don't think there's any shame in it. It's kind of, I feel like it's done when it's published. So I tend to treat my projects as very fluid. I know that's hard for some people, but I don't know. I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful to be flexible sort of as the manuscript makes its move into being ready to submit. And then the other thing about consistency I will note is that I think it's possible to edit your thematic and sort of stylistic things to bring things together more tightly in a strategic way. And that could be through repetition, creating a consistent setting or narrative, really anything of the sort that brings things together tightly if you feel like you're sort of missing some of that connective tissue. So in terms of your questions, I will say some questions are not addressed specifically in this section because the question was fully covered earlier in the workshop. So this is sort of what we have left. What is the number one edit or suggestion that could drastically improve the quality of writers putting together a cohesive, longer form manuscript like a chapbook? So I spent a while trying to figure out how to explain this, but I think of a good chapbook as kind of a Venn diagram of sorts. The thematic heart of the chapbook is really at the center with 3 or 4 circles intersecting that represent various ways of touching that topic. So these other circles may intersect as well, but the point is that I like a chapbook that is varied in the way that it handles a core subject without scattering too far. Must we succumb to the storied arc? So I would first of all say, and I'm speaking for myself as well as a few editor friends of mine, that I'd say I find editors looking for something that breaks out of the norm. So I would definitely say no. That's not to say that creating some kind of arc can't help with narrative clarity, but there's incredible chaps that don't subscribe to this theory. And narrative clarity can help a chap, but it's not a strict necessity if you create cohesion and flow in other ways, in my opinion. If there isn't a super strong connection between the pieces involved, or it just doesn't matter what order they go in, how do you arrange things? So I don't want to directly contradict what I just said about not needing an arc, because I do stand by it. But I think that thinking of the chap as a longer narrative can be helpful when your pieces don't necessarily have obvious connections to each other. I think this is also an opportunity to edit and write around other pieces, like I was talking about earlier. So I tend to let myself be fairly free when I'm constructing a sequence. In my opinion, I kind of feel like if it feels like it fits, assume it does. Have a friend give it a look over if you're not sure. And I'm a big advocate for doing a manuscript trade to get eyes on something before it goes out, but definitely also be sure there to ask if there's anything specific you're worried about. I tend to find that, like, you really have to look for stuff like that. Oftentimes you're the only person who's thinking like, well, what if it's to this or that? So I would say just don't be too anxious about the sequence of it. It'll kind of fit together as it's supposed to. And that's when a manuscript trade comes in handy for sure. What would be an appropriate amount of linked prose pieces, or can it just be a jumble of stuff? So it really comes down to length, in my opinion. A few longer pieces probably need to have a stronger link since you'll push your page count up quicker with longer pieces. But I would say that in general, shorter pieces don't need to have obvious connections to each other always. But they should still feel like they belong in the same universe, if that makes sense. Does a chapbook have to be poetry only? Do they usually have illustrations? So to tackle the first question, I have read some really incredible prose chapbooks. Definitely don't think a chap has to be poetry only. And then to tackle the second part of your question, I don't know that I'd say I've read a lot of chapbooks with illustrations. So I wouldn't say usually, but that's also absolutely not to say that a chapbook can't have illustrations. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that not all presses print their chapbooks in color due to budgetary constraints. For example, we do not. So while it's not something you can't do, definitely look at the guidelines for the specific place you're submitting to see what their policy on visual elements in chapbooks is. What percentage of pieces is generally allowed to have been previously published? So this varies widely from press to press, but generally I try to keep my ratios at least 50-50, if not leaning towards more unpublished pieces. So we accept up to 75% previously published work in chapbooks, but some presses are as low as 25. And then this is where the press-specific guidelines come in handy. And so there's also plenty of places that don't specify a limit for this at all. This tends to be the most common in chapbook contests, but I've seen it in regular submissions as well. So TLDR, definitely read the guidelines, but most of the places I've submitted recently are becoming more lenient with the quantity of previously published work in a chapbook, as long as the collection hasn't been published as a whole somewhere else before. I want to thank you all so much for your interest in the press. So if you're here because we're a potential home in your mind for your chapbook, I'm so excited to read your manuscript. Like really, actually, I mean that. Reading for chapbooks is one of my favorite parts of the year. And yeah, just have fun with it. Like we promise that we're all excited to read your work, and it's really exciting that you've decided to share it with us. So the other thing I wanted to say, just to kind of finish things off, is that if you do want to get an idea of sort of what we're interested in before September 17th, we have got our 2022 laser series in our web store. You can order a subscription to have a substantial discount on print copies up to this point. And then we also have a digital subscription and PDF copies of each of the chapbooks. So we're trying to make those as accessible as possible. So good luck, happy writing, and I'll see you on the 17th.